be more timely. It couldn't be more timely given the events of this week. We had both the Brexit minister in the UK, David Frost's speech on Tuesday, and we had the very detailed European Commission proposals on the Northern Ireland Protocol yesterday. So there's a lot to discuss. I'm just going to wait for another sort of 5 or 10 seconds, literally, because we had a lot of people signed up to this. So I'm just going to wait literally 10 or 15 seconds to let people catch up and make the Zoom link work and so forth. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers and get going with the event. And I'll repeat this twice probably, but if you want to just comment on the way along and discuss, obviously there's the chat function, but we will only be taking the questions through the Q&A function. So please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A function. Okay, well, I'm going to get going now, and more people may join us, but I can see the numbers are still going up. So I'm delighted to welcome our 2 speakers to this event this evening, as well as our expanding audience. We have Professor Katy Hayward, who's from Queens University Belfast, and in the last 5 years at least has become the most extraordinary, top quality and top expert on the issue of the Northern Ireland border throughout the swings of the Brexit negotiations and the agreements we now have. And so she is across both the difficult and challenging politics of this issue, but also the nitty-gritty technical details. So welcome, Katy. It's lovely to see you. I'm also delighted to welcome John Bruton to the event. As I'm sure our audience knows, he was Ireland's Taoiseach in the 1990s from 1994 to 97. He was the EU's ambassador to Washington in the noughties from 2004 to 2009, and he's not surprisingly therefore an eminent commentator on Irish, European and international affairs. So I think that's going to give us some excellent contributions to start our debate and discussion this evening. As I said, please use the Q&A function if you've got a question, and I will, when we get to the Q&A, I will pick up as many as I can and also as varied as I can. But our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we have plenty of time to run till around 6:15 or even 6:30 if there's enough interest in sustaining the questions that far. Those of you who paid attention to what the Brexit Minister David Frost said in Lisbon on Tuesday will have your own views on that. I thought it was a slightly extraordinary speech. I thought the tone and the timing, given it came a day before the Commission's proposals, was perhaps as unhelpful as the content. But I'm going to step back from my views and be a good moderator, or attempt to be. And I think, the question is exactly the right question. Can the Northern Ireland Protocol be made to work? Is David Frost just adopting what a British official said to me just this week, is the madman approach to talks, i.e. look like you might do something crazy and think you can win something from that? Or is it what the RTE journalist Tony Connolly called a forever war? And if it's a forever war, what is the UK government's strategy or point in that? And not least, as well as that, and I'm sure our speakers are going to cover this, are the European Commission proposals as generous and flexible and good enough as they look, or are they actually still problematic? For our overarching question, can the Northern Ireland Protocol be made to work? So with no further ado from me, I'm going to ask Katy Hayward to speak first. Katy, and you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. I was delighted to receive this invitation from David Gael. So thank you, David, for that. Thank you, Kirsty, for moderating. It's lovely to see you again too. And I should say it's a very particular privilege to be on a panel with former Taoiseach John Bruton, to whom the whole country, in fact, all our countries owe a great debt of gratitude in terms of the work you put in, John, for not only the origins of the peace process, but in maintaining your commitment to it. So thank you for that. I am going to share with you some thoughts that I put down in writing, which I don't often do without publishing them. These aren't published thoughts. I put them down on Sunday in response to a request from some colleagues in America who wanted to know what was going on and what might happen next. So these thoughts are prior to having seen and digested these non-papers from the EU. They come prior to Frost's speech in Lisbon as well. But ultimately, it was Sunday, which in some ways seems a very long time ago, but I would stand over the conclusion of them, which is quite an optimistic conclusion. So to answer the question directly, yes, I think the Northern Ireland Protocol can be made to work. And in these thoughts, which hopefully will take less than 10 minutes to go through, I consider the reasons why we might encounter some rocky periods and some turmoil yet before we get to that point of it working. So bear with me as I just talk through these. So there's an ever-growing amount of noise about the future of the protocol. Business and civic society in Northern Ireland have been told both by the UK and EU officials to expect increasing intensity in the discourse and tension in the coming weeks. So we've been basically told to fasten our seatbelts. Both the UK and the EU see this phase as the beginning of the end game, I think, when it comes to big adjustments to the protocol, and hence ramping up the stakes at this stage by both sides. The EU is keen to fix the big issues once and for all. Hence, Šefčovič saying yesterday, this is its final offer. They're stretching things as far as they can. And the UK sees its chance to get a harder Brexit, i.e. to loosen the remaining ties and the constraints that exist through the protocol. The language that Jeffrey Donaldson, as DUP leader, is using about the EU softening its stance now due to the hard tactics of the UK government is something that Frost likes to think too, i.e. that the EU bends when under time pressure and when resistance is shown. We saw this again on Newsnight actually last night. This will be repeated next in the coming weeks for sure, i.e. this idea that movement is welcome, but it's not far enough. However, and this is what I'm trying to think and trying to reflect on what we've seen happen time and time again. So in practice, we've always seen the UK bend, but with one or two odd concessions that they can sell as addressing the priorities they have flagged. The democratic consent vote, Article 18 of the protocol, being a case in point. And where the UK hasn't bent, the EU hasn't bent its line to accommodate it either, hence the realities of a hard Brexit that we are beginning to increasingly see. The UK government doesn't want to end up with no protocol and no TCA. Its actions and indeed its funding decisions, and we should remember the UK government has invested hundreds of millions of pounds already in operating the protocol. These suggest that they are committed to implementing the essentials of the protocol. The grace period unilateral extensions were in part because the UK government and Northern Ireland authorities were simply quite unready to manage the consequences of ending them. So why escalate now with unachievable aims, for example, no Court of Justice of the EU jurisdiction? Lord Frost said at the British-Irish Association at the beginning of September that it makes no sense to be in perpetual conflict with the EU and that he doesn't want that. And I do believe that he means that. And he repeated that in Lisbon as well. But at the same time, he does see this phrase, i.e. the current protocol talks, as a last chance to get what he wants in terms of a pure Brexit from the EU. He has Johnson's support in this for now. And with that, the Prime Minister's apparent willingness to stir the ire of business, to do battle with the judiciary and the House of Lords, and indeed to cause the economy genuine harm. So there seem to be worryingly few restraints on the UK game plan for escalation. And that's even before we think what they're prepared to risk in terms of stability here in Northern Ireland. But Johnson is a populist, and so how likely is he to stick with Frost, who's an ideologue, in risking a trade war with the EU over the protocol? At some point, sooner or later, the pressure point of UK-EU tensions will be felt in real terms close to home in southern England and not in near metaphysical terms over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Johnson went for a deal with the EU twice rather than face the consequences of holding out that bit too far for what is in essence a point of principle. There are limits to how deep the purist Brexitism dwells in most cabinet ministers. Frost is an exception around the cabinet table, not least in how he came to be there. He therefore has particular status and influence vis-a-vis the PM, but that's a weakness too. And just as happened with Cummings, who seemed to hold Johnson in his way for a time, Johnson won't be led all the way. At some point, the buck stops with him, and Frost is more likely to walk or be pushed than to be allowed to let all they work to achieve and sell in the UK-EU relationship come crumbling down, especially not at Christmas. Of course, some of this scenario depends on the willingness of the EU to contemplate and to use retaliatory measures. Even if they are agreed on that, such measures are difficult if the UK doesn't do anything rash in real terms, but just maintains its provocation, mainly in the discursive realm. Moreover, the EU would follow the procedures to get such retaliation, and this would mean at least a 6-month window between the arbitration panel finding in favour of the EU and temporary, proportionate and limited suspension of parts of the withdrawal agreement or TCA. The bigger risk then is a drawn-out standoff. This is very bad for Northern Ireland's certainty. Where and how will the pressure be felt to get to a deal in these circumstances? Most directly, it will be felt politically in Northern Ireland instability or economically in England as the impact of Brexit grows. The former, i.e. instability in Northern Ireland, can be more easily borne by the UK government than the latter. In the end, it may come down to the tolerance of the British public and the degree to which Johnson might want another win, as any agreement would be sold as, sooner rather than later. Indeed, we shouldn't forget the EU's proposals could be sold as a win by the UK government if it wished. It's just a matter of how much the government is going to let Frost try for a harder Brexit whilst he has the EU at the table. Is the patience and stamina for that inexhaustible around the cabinet table or amongst the British public? No. And it isn't in the EU either, and that may well push us towards retaliatory measures sooner than might otherwise occur. And for sure, the patience and stamina isn't inexhaustible in Northern Ireland. The way things seem to be at the moment is that it is unionist leaders who will move first, rather than loyalist protesters. The DUP may choose to increase the heat in the coming weeks if they think that strengthens the UK government's hand in the talks, but that hand will never provide them what they want. The DUP's 7 points being evidence of this. The DUP haven't given themselves much rope to climb down from their frankly unachievable goals, but that hasn't bothered them too much in the past. So they will be looking to come out of this situation having tied the protocol and the union together and be seen to be the most stalwart defenders of the union and leading opponents of the protocol. This may, we're all conscious of this may see them pull out of power sharing unless they're given a clear alternative. The most positive version of that is a clear line from the UK government that the talks are worth pursuing because the EU is likely to concede more. And with that, a line from the EU that it's willing to engage in the talks with a possibility of further adjustment to its proposals. And we're seeing some of this at the moment from the EU. A negative version of the alternative to the DUP pulling out of power sharing is some grand gesture by the UK government, triggering Article 16, for example. That would be utterly counterproductive on all fronts. No one can say precisely what it would be used to do, and it would really merely serve as a substitute for bold action that would satisfy a domestic audience. It would decrease stability, confidence in trading and investing in Northern Ireland. It would put business at odds with political leadership in the UK and unionism and make it harder for them to hold a united front. It would extend and problematize the negotiations, making us look set for more noise and distortion and uncertainty rather than less. And it would also reduce the likelihood of having the matter resolved before the May 22 elections, let alone by Christmas. The optimist in me thinks that the likely outcome of all of this is that the UK and EU have talks on the protocol into December, and that where we end up will be pretty much what the EU has proposed yesterday, but with some cover or fudge or shiny thing that the government can use to suggest they've won a victory on the ECJ point. We should all hope that the shiny thing is only negotiated after careful consultation with experts and stakeholders in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And again, I refer to the democratic consent vote as a good example of not having done that. If there is a UK-EU agreement, it doesn't mean we won't see future UK-EU bargaining. We should bear in mind the decision-making powers of the Joint Committee are quite considerable. But hopefully, this is the last chance for high-stakes games that make UK-EU negotiations over the protocol so intrinsically important for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was an excellent overview and analysis of the politics, and great to also hear, I think, what an optimistic take looks like, whether it's the future. We'll see, but I mean, amidst your optimism, that there is also some pessimistic scenarios in what you said. There's questions beginning in the Q&A box, but first we're going to go and hear John Bruton's take on all this, and I know he certainly where Katie ends is part of, perhaps, John, where you said you'd like to start in terms of the role of the European Court of Justice.
Well, I'm delighted that Katie is as optimistic as she is, because she's one of the closest observers of this issue in the world, in the sense of her knowledge of opinion in Northern Ireland, but also her knowledge of the way the European Union and the United Kingdom operate as political entities. That said, I'm a little bit less optimistic than she is. I think that the problems of Brexit are already being felt in the United Kingdom. Now, some of them may be due to COVID, some of them may be due to global supply chain problems that would have occurred, whether there was a Brexit or not. But to the extent that these problems are attributable to Brexit, I think the UK government prefers to be in conflict with the EU, because then it can blame the EU for the problems. Whereas if it has reached a settlement, now of course it's reached a settlement before, but if it reaches a new settlement, and there are still problems arising from Brexit, which there will be, because the EU policy, the EU statement of the last few days only addresses the Northern Ireland aspect of it. It doesn't address the issues that affect the United Kingdom, which will be slow burning issues affecting mutual recognition of judgments, mutual recognition of all sorts of things that are necessary for normal commerce to proceed, and people's consumer needs to be met. So I think there is a big incentive for the Conservative Party to maintain conflict with the European Union. The European Union is a convenient bouc émissaire, as they say in French, a sort of scapegoat for problems that are happening anyway. Now, it is significant, I think, chosen the focal point as their sort of issue that they will not surrender upon. Now, of course, they did accept the role of the European Court of Justice when they accepted the protocol in the first place. But now they're making this the issue. Now, this is an issue upon which, to my mind, the European Union cannot concede meaningfully without denying the essence of what the European Union is. It's important, I think, particularly for a general audience. I know we have probably quite a specialized and knowledgeable audience listening to this discussion, but for a general audience, it is important to remind ourselves that the European Union is essentially something very simple. It's a series of rules that apply to every member. These rules are made democratically through the European Council of Ministers, which contains elected politicians, and the European Parliament, which contains elected politicians. They're made democratically. They're enforced uniformly by a single body that has enforcement responsibility over member governments, the European Commission. And they are interpreted uniformly by a single body that is at the pinnacle of a court system in the European Union. And that means that we have the same interpretation of the meaning of any given EU directive, whether it be to do with electrical parts or any other matter affecting labour rights or whatever, that it's interpreted in the same way because there is an appeal ultimately to a single court, European.
Sorry, John, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because John, your sound is coming and going a bit, and I think we might just have to go to the, sorry to everybody, but the route of temporarily turning your video off. Thanks. Okay. That's better. Carry on. Sorry about that.
I tried to turn it off now, but.
Oh no, you're back. Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. Anyway, I think if the EU is concedes on the European Court of Justice, it is conceding what I think is an existential point. And given that the role of the European Court of Justice is being contested, for example, by the Polish Constitutional Court, and there are rumblings even that in the German Constitutional Court about the supremacy of EU law and the supremacy of decisions of the European Court of Justice. These are difficult enough issues internally for the EU to resolve. But if the EU has conceded anything to a member that has left the Europe, to a former member that has left the European Union, shall we say, in an atmosphere of bad faith, I think there will be a real internal problem for the EU in maintaining itself. Now, I'm not certain that people in Downing Street don't realise this. I think there are many people in the Conservative Party who are not satisfied just with Brexit. They would like to destroy the European Union. Now, I'm not saying they're a majority in the Conservative Party. They probably are not, but they have this visceral appeal to many people, and I worry about this. I think we should also bear in mind the overall political context. Brexit is happening in a world that has become much more fractious and where peace has become much more fragile than it was 10 years ago. Treaties don't mean what they used to mean. And we're seeing in the escalating of demand, the abrogation or the attempted abrogation of treaties, the escalation of demands, and when a demand is met, it is replaced by a new demand. We're seeing behaviors that are not dissimilar to the sort of behaviors we saw in 1938 in the lead up to the Munich crisis. And I think that's something that we should be very, very careful about. The UK wants to be in security cooperation with its neighbours, but if it's not in a position to abide by agreements that it has made, the underlying trust that's required for any form of security cooperation is absent. So I'm very worried about this. I'm also worried, I have to say, about the position of the European Union. Supposing the European Union decides that it is going to have to withdraw the concessions it has made to the UK under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and reintroduce tariffs on goods coming from the UK into the European Union. This raises the question, where would those tariffs be collected on goods coming from Northern Ireland into the European Union across the land border in Ireland? The EU would be then in a position that it was the one imposing the border. And that's something that I think people in London who have mala fides towards the European Union and towards the irritation that is Ireland, could easily exploit. So I sincerely hope that Katy is right and that my pessimism is misplaced. But I think it's probably best to warn at this stage rather than to be too complacent at this stage.
Excellent. Thank you both very much for that great overview of the politics, and because in the end, although this is about the technical side of actually dealing with some of the problems there has been so far, and that's why responses of business in Northern Ireland in the last day have been very important and interesting. But the bottom line is, as you've both in your different ways made clear, is really about the politics. And I'm just going to slip in one question from me before I go to the very interesting lot of questions we're accumulating in the Q&A box, and it's for both of you, but it comes to what, John, you just said at the end there, that of course, you know, if there was a trade war, if the EU went to the dramatic extent of suspending some or all of the trade and cooperation agreement, that would risk either a border between Ireland and the rest of the EU or on the island of Ireland. And yet the one or two people I've spoken to recently about that in the EU, obviously they're fully aware, John, of that, and that's the last thing they want. But if they think that the suspending Article 16 was actually going to happen, do they not see the threat of suspending the trade and cooperation agreement as something so big that it would be the way to actually force Boris Johnson back to a more sensible deal? And in other words, they do, of course, just like you, see the risk, but they're interpreting the negotiating dynamics differently.
You're obviously speaking to people who are directly involved in the negotiations. I'm speaking as an external observer, looking at what people are actually saying. If suspending the trade and cooperation agreement isn't the last resort of the European Union, and if it's something that's ruled out, if Britain continues to attempt to walk away from its agreement on the protocol, regardless of the clarifications and improvements that have been advanced, I have to ask, what other lever has the European Union got? And if it hasn't got another lever, what can be done?
Katy, what's your take on this very difficult scenario?
So I distinguish between, if Article 16 was triggered and they did go the proper routes for that, there is potential for rebalancing measures, and those would have to be counter to whatever the UK government decides to do to use Article 16 for. And again, I just always come back to the question of what would it be used for specifically, given that we have a standstill on the grace periods, and given that it really would be almost more, create a huge amount of disruption to, for example, as some people sort of glibly say, well, get rid of all the customs procedures on goods entering Northern Ireland from GB. So I struggle to see it doing it for that grand purpose. And then in terms of retaliatory measures, again, we should bear in mind, if the EU was to follow the procedures for this, you're talking at least 6 months before they would kick in. And therefore they could be carefully considered. And I don't think, if you think about in terms of the amount of trade that would be coming into the single market from Northern Ireland, and say that if they decided to impose tariffs on all goods coming into the EU from GB, that would be something. To come into the EU from the UK, it would be, you'd have to sort of balance out the risks for that. So even in principle, if it's all UK, suddenly let's just imagine Northern Ireland's no longer aligned with the EU, etc., etc. In terms of the the problems of trying to gather, as John says, going to gather those duties, etc. It just wouldn't make any sense. So if you're wanting to sort of basically show the value of having the TCA, and of course there are other aspects to that as well, including access to research programs and the like, you would be wanting to focus on GB into the EU rather than keep attention on the Irish border and the huge difficulties, to say the least, in imposing a hard border.
Great. Okay, I am now going to go on to as many of our questions as we can get through, and I think I'm going to start with two, one from Joe Pye and one from Jenny, on different aspects of a public opinion question. Joe asks whether the Northern Ireland public are aware that they're doing better than the rest of GB, in his opinion, and is the majority happy with that? And Jenny says, how is the behaviour of the UK government perceived by public opinion in Ireland? So feel free to take one or both of those questions. And John, can we start with you? What about behaviour of, how the behaviour of, the extraordinary behaviour of the UK government is perceived in Ireland by the public?
I think they're puzzled and exasperated with the way in which the current Conservative government, led by Boris Johnson, is dealing with this matter. We've had experience going back, as far back as Harold Wilson, right through all of the other British prime ministers, including Theresa May, of a UK government that's very conscious of the important balance that has to be struck in regard to Northern Ireland and the importance of Ireland as a neighbour of Britain and as a neighbour that ought to be kept on good terms. There is a sense that in Ireland that the English public completely ignored Ireland when it voted for Brexit, didn't trouble itself to inform itself, and that we now have a government that is, if you like, expressing that in practical terms, that disinterest in practical terms, by basically not taking account of the need for subtlety in it.
Sorry, John, we're losing the sound again, so you might need to put your video off again. Thanks.
Yeah, so there is a, now one has to bear in mind that there's always in Ireland, in this part of Ireland anyway, a sort of reflex anti-British sentiment which comes to the surface anyway. It's something that has no, I don't identify with at all. But that sentiment is now being offered unexpected justification by what has happened, and it is creating major difficulties, I think, for many in Ireland who want to have, on issues unrelated to the European Union, a good relationship with Britain. I think that's becoming more difficult, and to a degree negating the efforts that were made, for example, by Her Majesty the Queen when she came to Ireland and was so expressive in the way she spoke about reconciliation and recognised the divergence of opinions. That subtlety on Her Majesty's part is certainly not evident in the attitude of our government at the present time.
And I think, Katie, I mean, you've done a lot of work, obviously, on public opinion in Northern Ireland, and it's obvious to anybody watching events, the amount that the media have focused on the DUP in the last 5 years rather than the fact that, like in Scotland, a majority voted for Brexit is quite extraordinary. So what do you say about how public opinion in the North is currently looking at all these developments and at the protocol?
Mm-hmm. So we've actually just conducted, this weekend past, we did our latest Queen's Lucid Talk poll on opinion on the protocol. So I haven't seen, we're just cleaning the data at the moment, so I really look forward to analysing those, and we're asking some new questions on different matters, including relating to the command paper, etc. So they'll be released at the end of the month. In the meantime, just to refer to that data on views on with regards to the government, one thing that was consistent in our March poll and our June poll was how high, and when I say high, I mean extraordinarily high, the levels of distrust of the UK government are. So that's, so 6% say that they trust the UK government when it comes to handling the protocol and Northern Ireland's interests therein. So this, we've got a clear majority of unionists, over 80%, saying they distrust the UK government in that. Almost 6 in 10 unionists saying they strongly distrust the UK government when it comes to handling Northern Ireland's interests in the protocol. They also distrust the they also distrust the EU Commission, and they also distrust the Irish government in this one, which of course, well, which unsurprisingly, Irish nationalists don't. They trust the Irish government and they trust the EU Commission. To get to the point about how people here view what's happening in GB, well, I think it's, so some people say that's evidence of Brexit and the disruption, and we are lucky to have the protocol and we do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And indeed, some unionists are also concerned that Northern Ireland could end up, if the UK government pushes too hard, could end up in a much worse economic situation. Because of course, this was the worry through Brexit. With no particular deal or arrangements for Northern Ireland, it really could be in the worst of both worlds. So there are concerns in that regard. But I should say that some look at what's happening in GB, most particularly Southern England, and are saying that's got nothing to do with Brexit. And they believe the Prime Minister in that. And similarly to, they would point to things like the speed of rolling out the COVID vaccine as examples of why it's a good thing to be part of the UK and outside of the EU. So again, a lot comes down to the point of view people are taking when it comes to how they look across at GB and understand the impacts of Brexit and the working out of that. So I hope that answers those questions. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Katie and John. So a couple of questions about Joe Biden and Washington, the US, and how this is viewed from there. Sam Page asks, what kind of pressure could Joe Biden put on Johnson and Frost to both ensure the protocol, the agreement with the EU is respected, the Good Friday Agreement is upheld, and we've just talked about views in Ireland and Northern Ireland of what's going on. What does it look like from Washington? John, would you like to go first on that?
Well, I think the original hope that the UK government had was that they could get a trade agreement with the United States, and that would, if you like, reorient England away from the continent of Europe towards the greater English-speaking world. That's not going to happen. It was never going to happen. As long as it was a prospect that it might happen, it was a lever that could be used. But it's pretty clear that there isn't, I think, an appetite in Congress for a trade agreement with almost anybody at the present time, including the United Kingdom. There is, of course, pressure that the US can put on the United Kingdom if the United Kingdom were to be seen to be acting to create conditions in which a border was being imposed in Ireland, or something was being done that was clearly adverse and unfairly adverse to the interests of Ireland by the UK. But it's not entirely clear to me what would be the precise lever that Joe Biden could pull that would cause sufficient discomfort in London for London to abandon a policy that appeared to be delivering domestic political dividends. And if my original thesis is correct, that the more continuous and long duration the conflict with the EU is, the more political bonuses there are for the Conservative Party. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm not so sure that there's a lot that Joe Biden can do. On the other hand, if, as Katie says, and I hope she's right, that in fact the discomfort arising from Brexit will increase, and that the UK will have an incentive to stop this conflict reasonably soon, then in a way, Joe Biden's intervention won't be necessary.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to look through we've got a lot of different interesting questions here. We've got one, and I've lost the specific one, but we've got one, not surprisingly, that asks about the potential for Irish unification and if the protocol stays in place, the current and potential future impact on those dynamics. I'm just looking at some figures I had for a speech I gave earlier, a talk I gave earlier this week, which shows, and this is very early days, but in the first half of this year, since we left the EU's single market, British exports to Ireland have fallen 32%, so by a third, whereas Northern Ireland exports to Ireland have gone up 60%. So, we have to see how those figures settle down, if the protocol itself settles down, and given the pandemic and supply chain issues. But some thoughts, maybe starting with you, Katie, on the unification dynamics.
Yes. So I'll say one thing and then move to the other. And so the first thing to say is, according to the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, which is the most reliable social attitude survey in Northern Ireland, and I run the political attitudes modules for that. So we've been asking since 2016 as to how people see Brexit impacting on the prospects for United Ireland, and also how it affects their views as to whether they're more in favour of it or less in favour of a United Ireland as a result of Brexit. And as you might expect, nationalists are increasingly expectant of Irish unity as a result of Brexit, and increasingly want to see it, or strongly want to see it. Unionists in 2020, a plurality of unionists now think that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. So that's in partly a response to the protocol. And unsurprisingly, perhaps they are less in favour of it than they were before. And then those who are neither unionists nor nationalists, which is the largest proportion of the population here, not only have they increasingly thought that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely, we saw a huge rise in 2019 to 2020 amongst the proportion of those who are neither, saying that they are more in favour of Irish unity. So that's the context within which, and of course these are social attitude surveys, are not impeccable by any means, but it's a good indication, I think, of the context within which people are considering these questions. However, I would urge caution on several fronts. And the one is this idea of, which is very much, I think, behind unionist concerns around the protocol and its implications, and indeed relating to those figures that you mentioned, Kirsty, this idea that the all-Ireland economy has been protected and indeed strengthened at the expense of Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market, and therefore that this upholds the momentum, or speeds the momentum towards Irish unity. But we must put this in context of Northern Ireland is no longer in the European Union. It's in the single market for goods de facto, but it's outside the single market for other things. And most particularly, a lot of the areas in which we've seen cooperation growing north-south over time, particularly post-agreement, of course, now Northern Ireland's in a different regulatory zone to Ireland, and of course over time that risk of divergence increases. So we've had, obviously Ireland and the UK were members of the EU for the same period of time, and the degree to which we've had integration across the Irish border has perhaps been much less than we might have otherwise expected. Certainly it didn't create the momentum towards Irish unity. Now we have that the Irish border in that sense is going to be increasingly hard as a border. So although Article 11 of the protocol talks about maintaining the conditions for North-South cooperation across a wide range of areas, education, environment, agriculture, etc. In those areas, we're no longer in the same basket of the single market. And so that cooperation will be increasingly difficult. And indeed, there are challenges to the all-island economy as well, not least because of the integration of these supply chains and the fact that a lot of goods going into the south come via GB. So it's highly complicated. So that isn't often mentioned, and I could go on a long time about this, and I won't. But as a sociologist, I just would be really careful about seeing things going one particular direction, because the picture is much more complicated, and the protocol certainly doesn't push things in one particular direction, because, as I say, Northern Ireland is outside of the EU now, and there will be consequences of that over time.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, and I think that point that the protocol is about Northern Ireland effectively being in the single market for goods when the single market has full freedoms is a really important one, and isn't heard enough, I think, at least in the British media. John, what's your take on the current and longer term dynamics in terms of Irish unification?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate, as you have done, that Katie has made a very important point, that in every area except goods, Northern Ireland is going to be moving further away from the rest of Ireland, given that Northern Ireland is no longer in the EU and Ireland is. And that is so there's going to be two sets of forces in conflict with one another. And I think in a way, the problem of Northern Ireland isn't a problem of goods. It's a problem of people's hearts, people's allegiances, people's sense of who they are. And up until now, people in the two parts of Ireland were part of the same European Union. And they felt that to some extent or other in their hearts. That's no longer the case. The triggering of a United Ireland opinion, a poll, is in the hands of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. In fact, the provision in the Good Friday Agreement doesn't even say that the Government of Ireland would have to be consulted about the calling of such a poll, which is very strange. I think there's also practical issues to be borne in mind. The idea that, like Brexit, you could carry a United Ireland by 51 to 49%, and with the 49% including people, some of whom were violently opposed to the majority decision. That's a nightmarish scenario. I don't think that the security apparatus of the state to which I belong is capable of dealing with that sort of issue at this stage anyway. And I think we have to think a lot about this. There's nothing inevitable. I think this is the point that Katie made, and I underline it. There's nothing inevitable about anything of this. And unlike Marxists, I don't believe that economic forces necessarily are determinative. I think it's people's sense of who they are that is determinative in matters of this nature. And I don't think we've reached a point where we have a live possibility of unity in the medium or near future anyway.
Thanks. I think there's both. We could have obviously a whole session just on the points you've both raised in that. But can I just now bring us back then to some of the UK and the UK government politics and Tory party politics? We've got a number of different questions here that I think I might try and point you to together, and then you again choose which ones you want to comment on. James has asked, do you think the UK is trying to force the Republic of Ireland out of the EU? Somebody else said, was the timing of Frost's speech a dead cat, because it was the day of the extraordinary first, and very important first report on the UK government's handling of the COVID crisis. Bill Rogers asks about the Johnson government feeding off confrontation, which I think both of you, touched on in your opening remarks. And Sandy asks about the underlying motives of the anti-European Brexiter Tories. So in a sense, you both commented on these political dynamics in your opening remarks, and the scenarios of where this might go does very much come back, I think, to how we see those remarks unfolding, and where, Katy, you were perhaps a bit more optimistic than John. But so in the spirit of those varied questions, could you perhaps comment a bit further on trying to read this belligerent British government? Maybe Katy first.
Well, this isn't my favorite topic, I have to say, to try and just constantly trying to rationalize the approach here and trying to think what the strategy is. And that was in part why I put those notes down in writing, because I wanted to move because you feel too much caught up in, well, what do they really think? What is really at work here? And I sort of tried to and think it through, as I say, rationally, and going on what's happened in the past, especially when we have that sense of anxiety of it being chaotic, which is what we've had, and no wonder we're tired, because that's what we've had, year after year. If you think of the no deal, and now we're, I'm just a member of the public trying to make sense of it all, but the poor officials who are having to prepare for no deal, both obviously no withdrawal agreement and no TCA. I mean, one silver lining is I think some of them ended up using some of those prep for managing the COVID crisis. But so we've been in this extraordinary situation for so long now, and certainly there is this almost sense of them acting as if there's no consequences. But as I say, even with Johnson, ultimately he has come to a compromise, if he can sell it as not being a compromise. And there's a lot going on there in terms of, and this is a slight side point, but about the ECJ, some people have been hearing speculating recently on, well, what a compromise might look like. And actually, funnily enough, what they're talking about is actually what is the case at the moment, i.e. an arbitration panel that only refers it to the ECJ and in certain circumstances. So, that's some cause for hope as well. And just on the point about, and John will have much more to say on this than I would, and certainly more informed, but about the idea of pushing Ireland out of the EU, I don't see that. I think much more common perhaps is just almost an ignorance that Ireland is a distinct and valued member state of the European Union. And particularly, we saw that in the early days of Brexit and proposed solutions to Brexit, and some remarks that were said around Ireland's place. So I wouldn't say it's been a learning curve, because I think some people are still a long way to go in terms of learning, but it is remarkable how just how myopic some of the reaction to the realities of Brexit have been. So I won't say any more. But as I say, ultimately, in rationalizing it, you would end up being slightly more optimistic, I think.
Great, thanks, Katie. John, what's your take on trying to lead the British government in the midst of all this?
I don't think that there is anyone explicitly working to get Ireland out of the European Union. I think for that to be the case, Ireland would have to be a place that people were thinking about. And I don't think people in London are thinking about Ireland in any deliberate way. Ireland is just almost as if Ireland didn't exist, I think, until it's forced into one's way as an issue to be dealt with. What I do think, however, is that there would be a small school of thought in the Conservative Party that would like to see the European Union broken up. And this would be reflective of hundreds of years of English statecraft, where they never wanted any one power to be dominant on the continent of Europe, and a united Europe is not something, therefore, that fits into the way people in England see their sort of how the world around them should be arranged. Now, Ireland could be a subsidiary issue or a subsidiary tool in a plan to dismantle the European Union, but I don't think it'll be the most important tool. But I think this is a minority viewpoint. I don't think it's going to predominate. To this extent, I'm optimistic. I think the issue really is, does the British government feel that there's more political gain to be got out of prolonging this row? Or on the other hand, do they think that we've got all we can out of this and we've got to settle it and create some atmosphere around it that says this is a great victory, and the EU would be delighted to facilitate Britain in this. I mean, the EU doesn't care if Britain has a victory on paper or in the newspapers. All they're interested in is the substance. So I think you could imagine that the UK could be granted that victory in appearance. But I think it is a political calculation about what's best for the re-election of the current government in Westminster.
And I mean, as you say, John, it's, or as you said earlier, looking rationally at the UK interests, like in terms of security cooperation with different EU member states, although, as you just said, there may be a fairly mature, grown-up willingness on the EU side to give Johnson whatever headline he wants in the press for a day, as long as it's not giving in on principles like the ECJ. I mean, the damage Johnson is then doing to his bilateral relations, I mean, relations with France, at the lowest ebb in decades, different commentators will tell you. So, I mean, you were Taoiseach, when you see this sort of irrational and terribly short-term behavior, and of a government with an 80-seat majority, and that remarkably, to my mind, is still ahead in the polls. I mean, do you feel you're struggling to explain it, or just that it does all fit into that certain Brexit ideology that got Boris to power, Johnson to power in the first place?
I think what we're seeing in the way the UK government is conducting its business is very much in tune with the zeitgeist in the English-speaking world. We're seeing in the other great English-speaking country, the United States, an almost, hyper-nationalism, celebration of a lack of curiosity about other countries, and a focus on oneself alone, America first, England first, or whatever it is. So this will happen, I think, in the world, to be going through a phase like that in the English, at least in the two big parts of the English-speaking world. I'm not familiar enough with Australian or Canadian politics to see whether, I don't think those factors are quite so marked in those countries, but something is going on. There's a sort of, if you like, the UK and the United States in the past and in the recent past were sort of arbiters of the world. So they didn't need to develop a sense of their own individual nationalism. Now, the UK is no longer an arbiter of the world. The United States is less an arbiter of the world than it was. And it is, therefore, the circumstances are good for a resurgence in nationalism in England and a resurgence in nationalism in America. And my feeling is that nationalism, wherever it raises its head, it uses irrational forces to mobilize people, and it frequently does very great damage. And I'm afraid, we've had experiences of that in our history. The hyper-nationalism in Ireland in the 1920s, 1930s, and so on led to all sorts of problems for our country. We've learned something from that, and we're not going in that direction in Ireland. But I think England is sort of having to repeat some of the errors we made 100 years ago in order to discover that this is not leading to anywhere good. I don't know how long it'll take for the penny to drop, so to speak, or the euro, but it mightn't be that quick.
I agree. It certainly doesn't look very quick. Katie, do you want to comment some more on that, or you're fine? Okay, couldn't we go to a more specific question, which about some of the detail of what the Commission offered yesterday? Someone called ATPS, so I'm not sure who that is, but it's a good question. And it says, could pressure from Northern Ireland businesses and traders persuade Johnson to back down on the ECJ demand? But I think the second part of this question is rather important. Will business people be satisfied with the practical solutions to the specific issues which the EU has offered, seeing the Court of Justice is of little relevance? So, I mean, I think the kind of overnight and instant reactions from my cursory reading sounds quite positive, but I mean, we're talking about this very difficult nationalist politics, but some of the technical stuff, the devil certainly is in the detail, and it's not, however kind of flexible the EU has been, this is not taking away the border that has been agreed by dint of the protocol. So Katie, how do you see that?
Yes. So, I mean, it has been encouraging, I think, to many here that the EU appears to have listened to specific concerns expressed from business groups and from civil society here. And obviously Šefčovič was keen to say that yesterday, that this is direct and genuine response, as he put it, to what he heard when he came here to Northern Ireland in early September. But these are not solutions. So it's interesting in the way they've been set out and the presentation of them. which are, the way that Shevkovich has it yesterday, it's the most sort of generous, sort of ambitious interpretation of what could be done, like 80% reduction in checks, etc. Because if you look at what they're setting out, they're very careful to say there are several conditions here, and I know without a doubt that the UK would balk at those, because we always come back to that infamous trilemma. Essentially, the more the UK wants, or GB, or more specifically the British government wants to diverge from the EU, then the more difficulties we have, and still the more difficulties we'd have down the Irish Sea. So we're not really escaping from that. And again, we come back to that question of how much the UK's government's concerns here are for what the difficulties are in Northern Ireland, which are more complicated and more nuanced and more extensive than these non-papers addressed from the EU. So there are big issues that aren't addressed by the EU in these proposals. And then the degree to which the UK government wants something else. And I do think we're going to see that increasingly, and it'll be interesting to see what the unionist parties decide to do. So whether, for example, if the business groups come out and say, good on this, we need more on this, whether the Ulster Unionist Party would support them in that, or and then how that shapes the UK government's reaction. And this will be interesting to see, because then, as I mentioned, you'll see possibly new tensions arising between businesses in the UK government and businesses and unionism here, which is not a good thing. So I would say expect sort of cautious responses, and if we are to get to a place where businesses can warmly, well, obviously it's a huge step forward. It's great to see them moving with ambition on this, but there's a long way to go yet before I think we'd have something that could be workable and then lauded and hailed as perhaps the EU would like to have seen yesterday by businesses.
John, do you have particular comments on that one, the sort of the business politics kind of different views and dynamics in response to this? What's going to be, most people seem to think, we're not jumping to a cliff edge crisis tomorrow, not least with the COP coming up, but there are the detailed issues also feed into the political dynamics and not just the posturing.
Unfortunately, British business proved not very influential in the Brexit referendum. So I'm not so sure that Northern Ireland business, which is a very small part of the United Kingdom overall, will be that influential with the UK government in regard to these matters. But it is good that they have been listened to. It is good that they have expressed the views they have expressed. But I think as I said, I'm afraid this is not a rational process in the conventional deal-making sense. This is a political process where symbolism is more important than reality. And
I mean, I just rather casually said, oh, a lot of this, if this is going to get to a worse place before it gets to a better place, a lot of that may wait till after COP26, starting right at the end of October. But Bill Rogers wonders in another question, does the alienation of the EU and post-colonial wariness internationally around the term global Britain, does that pose risks for COP26? I mean, how easy or hard is it to stop these things leaching across from one important area to another? John, what's your take on that?
I wouldn't think that's the problem, really. I mean, the fact that this COP22 is taking place in Britain, it could be taking place anywhere in the world. There's an urgent issue to be resolved here, and I think the effort will be made by all to resolve the problem as far as they can, and if that gives credit to Boris Johnson, well and good. That's not a problem for anybody, I think. I think the difficulty is, as we found here in Ireland in a recent opinion poll, everybody's in favour of combating climate change. But when they went down to, I think it's 7 or 8 different things that might be done to combat climate change as far as Ireland is concerned, substantial majorities of voters were against every one of the measures that might be proposed. So the battle to save the climate is going to have to be fought in the trenches in each individual country in the world. National declarations or international declarations are going to be of very limited effect. And I don't think, certainly speaking for my own country, that public opinion has yet seriously engaged with this. This is, I think, dealing with climate change is going to be a very uncomfortable process for most people in most developed countries. It's going to be uncomfortable, not comfortable. And I don't think that people are being led on this issue adequately. We're setting targets for ourselves, but when it comes to the measures, I'm not so sure public opinion is ready for accepting them.
Yeah. Before I let us move off into that crucial discussion, let me bring it back then now a bit more to UK and Ireland, and maybe Katie, for you, somebody I haven't got the question in front of me right now, but so I don't have the name, but somebody asked, is there any role for Scotland and the Scottish Parliament? And you and I wrote a paper 3 years ago, which seems a very long time ago, on Scotland and Northern Ireland approaches to Brexit, given that they were and are the two, Remain voting areas of the UK. But it's remarkable in some ways how disconnected those discussions and tensions have been. And somebody called Anne asked, could somehow the border be moved to the Scotland-England land border? This is a question that I've seen sometimes come up in the Scottish debate, but to me doesn't really add up. So any sort of comments on that? You've got the 4 devolved nations, but you've also got devolution under attack, which I think we commented on and predicted in our paper 3 years ago. But does that feed in at all to these specific protocol dynamics, or is that really just again part of those wider UK fragmentation stresses, but not really specifically feeding into this?
Yes. So the wish of the Scottish government to maintain continuity, if you like, with the EU and alignment with the EU. This is, of course, meaning that the protocol and Northern Ireland's places of particular interest to Scotland. But immediately we come up with the challenge of how that happens and what it actually looks like. And a big, well, it's not been publicized because it's very technical and detailed and completely unsexy as a thing to be looking at. But the idea of how you manage to keep an eye on what's been updated and amended at the EU level, that therefore you'd want Scotland to continue to be aligned with, and indeed what Northern Ireland has to be aligned with. It's actually much more complicated to work out than one would imagine, and difficult to follow. And it's interesting that part of the EU's proposals on non-papers yesterday, the one dealing with stakeholders, emphasizes transparency, which is something some of us have been banging on about for a long time. And it suggests that it promises to put up a website where you can see what that legislation will be. So that will be interesting to Scotland as well. But then, of course, we immediately come to, and I don't want to go too deeply into this, but you come to the UK Internal Market Act and what that means in real terms for Scotland, and and indeed for Wales, in terms of its ability to, in real terms, to maintain that continuity, and the limits too of the common frameworks, etc., to keep the four parts of the UK aligned. So it's extremely complicated picture, as I say, not just in the ambition of it, and the sort of the logic of it if you follow it through, but also simply in the practicalities of being able to maintain that ambition. And then on the with regards to the Anglo-Scottish border, so I'm working with colleagues on this now to sort of think it through, and even thinking through what the EU's proposals here might look like in that form. But again, and I'm sorry to sound boring on this, but again, it just comes back to that question of how much the UK and England will have diverged by that point, because always minimizing checks and controls requires confidence that what's crossing the border is allowed to cross the border. As I wrote in a blog for the Scottish Centre on European Relations some time back, you know, that it's easier in some ways to manage the Anglo-Scottish border in many ways than the Irish land border, if you're talking those practical terms about main roads, etc. But always you have to put it in the context of that wider process of divergence and what it will look like when we get to that point. Because the EU is talking ambitiously here about surveillance and monitoring IT, and you know, being able to be guaranteed things won't move on beyond the consumer, etc. And that'll look a bit more complicated in the case of an independent Scotland in the EU.
Thanks. I think it's maybe a topic for another day for European Movement in Scotland events, but there is, the Scottish Parliament has 2 inquiries at the moment with open call for evidence if anyone wants to contribute. It's on the Holyrood website, one on the Internal Market Act, one on Scotland's relations to the EU at the moment, and so you're absolutely spot on in terms of the aim in the Scottish government's own continuity bill to keep pace, at least in devolved areas, with EU legislation in the environment, for instance, is very complicated, not least in terms of keeping tabs on what's going on and what might or might not be actually kept pace with, whereas, as you say, Northern Ireland absolutely does have to. John, any thoughts from you on you know, the wider, you're fully aware of Scotland's independence debate and the sort of stresses and strains across the UK's constitutional setup. Any thoughts on that? I mean, does that also then feed into EU attitudes, Irish and EU attitudes, that the UK is just in a very unstable and unpredictable state, for instance?
Well, I think people speaking from the European Union, as I am speaking from Dunboyne and County Meath, have to be very careful not to interfere or be seen to interfere in an internal UK debate. Obviously, we have sympathies with countries in the UK that have the same view about the European Union as we have, but that's about as far as we can go, I think, with this. I think, however, we should be thinking about creative ways in the medium to long term of bringing European countries into closer understanding with one another. It's one of my great regrets that Britain excluded the option of joining the European Economic Area, whereby they could have left the European Union but continued to have some input into European Union legislation, as do the EEA members currently. Thinking about the problems of the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is a genuine democratic deficit problem insofar as Northern Ireland is not represented in the European Parliament, it's not represented in the Council of Ministers, and to the extent that legislation is passed concerning goods that will have to be applied in Northern Ireland, it will be applied in a territory where the people representing that territory haven't been involved in the making of the regulation. I was wondering whether you could imagine some sort of associate arrangement for Northern Ireland vis-a-vis the European Economic Area, that for discussion on goods, Northern Ireland could, and the Stormont ministers could have observer status in the EEA. And that would have to have the consent of the UK government, it would have to have the consent of the EEA, it would have to have the consent of the European Union. But it would go some small distance towards remedying this genuine democratic deficit problem. And it is a genuine problem. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think it's a particularly important problem from the perspective of the Unionist community in Northern Ireland. If you think of who the Unionist community in Northern Ireland are, they're the same people in a way, or they're related to the people who made the American Revolution because they didn't want taxation without representation. So democratic involvement is a very important Unionist value. Now, it's also a value in my part of Ireland too, but it is a Unionist value. And I think we need to try and find ways to recognize that. Now, the proposals by Commissioner Vice President Šefčovič do address that, but not in the sort of broader institutional way that I think it could be possible. And there are creative things that could be done, but there's not much point putting them on the table unless there's some chance that they might be accepted.
I think that's really both an interesting and an optimistic point, perhaps, to draw this conversation to an end. You know, we don't know when relations may improve between the UK and the EU, and when we may have a less nationalist government. But if we do start moving in a more positive direction in years to come, then that relationship EU-UK, including ways to perhaps be closer, but also, if we're going to align more closely, bring the democratic side of it with us, is certainly going to be necessary. Well, I can only thank very much all of our audience who've stayed and listened and engaged and put questions and comments and so forth. Many thanks to European Movement in Scotland for organising this, and especially to Caitlin for sorting out all the text side, and then most of all, of course, a huge thanks to Katy Hayward and to John Bruton for what I think we can all agree was absolutely fascinating insight. I feel we've kind of done three events in one here, so I think you both deserve, I hope you both get an hour of relaxing evening. We don't have a precise date or topic for the next European Movement event, but it will probably be in November, so do check the EMIS website, and anyone who feels after listening to this brilliant seminar that they would like to give £1 or £2 to help support this important work of the European Movement in Scotland, we'll find a donate button also on that website. So on that note, just thank you again many times to Katy and John, and let's hope some of your more optimistic scenarios amid the more pessimistic ones perhaps come true, and before Christmas. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.